Hello and welcome to the program. The catastrophic man-made famine in Ukraine in 1932 and 1933 was largely ignored by the international community. The Soviet authorities were successful at covering up and keeping it a secret. Now, it was one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Even in the USSR, it wasn't really mentioned. One of the reporters who did manage to bring the story of the Holodomor to light was Rhea Clyman. Now, joining us today is award-winning documentary filmmaker Tkach. He's created a film about her journey. It's called Hunger for Truth, the Rhea Clyman Story. He joins us now. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, first off, can you tell a little bit more about the film and kind of your idea behind it?
Well, the film was based on the work of a young Canadian journalist who was pretty much unknown even in Canada up to this point. Her work was discovered by a group of historians at the University of Alberta in Canada, one of them being Yars Balan. And they were just doing a blind search of the archives to see what was written about the Holodomor in the Canadian press. And lo and behold, they found that there was this woman who had written over 20 articles on it, and very early on. She wrote them mostly about a trip she took in September 1932. Now, prior to doing that trip, she had gone to the Arctic, believe it or not, to write about the Gulag. And as a result of those reports, she was kicked out of the Soviet Union. But before they kicked her out, she made the trip from Moscow to Tbilisi by car with two American women who had arrived there, two like socialites, you know. So they had an unescorted trip. You know, that's very important in terms of what her reporting was like, from Kharkiv through the Oblast, Kharkiv Oblast, down into Donetsk, where the war is going on right now, and finally out to Tbilisi, where she was arrested and sent back to Moscow, given 2 days notice and evicted to Poland. So the basis of the film is that journey.
When you first read about her story and when you were asked to make this film, what impacted you the most from her story and kind of made you want to make a film about her?
I had like 4 days off, and I just kind of locked myself up and, you know, wrote it based on the articles. And what gripped me right away is that it's very much told from like a first person kind of point of view. It's almost like a journal, you know, so you could very easily visualize, you know, making a film about it. The problem is that there's so little material, and Rhea, you know, there's 3 or 4 pictures of her, that's it, right? So the challenge in making a film is, you know, how do you animate it? How do you make it interesting visually? We all know that, you know, the Holodomor was covered up, so people, you know, paid with their lives who tried to take photographs or were sent to, you know, labor camps. So that was the big challenge.
What was your impression about when you yourself of Ukrainian background, and when you started to learn more about what she had seen and what she had experienced potentially during her trip across Ukraine? What sort of impressions and what sort of ideas were running through your head at the time?
Well, you know, we'd all been raised on stories, you know, of the Holodomor. It wasn't a you know, unknown period of history to us. It's just that it's never been kind of widely disseminated except for specialized historical, you know, research. So my feeling is, you know, how do we you know, have it, you know, have an impact for general viewers, right? So I you know, made an effort to find, you know, all the correct historical material, because the problem is that a lot of films in the past had mixed, you know, the famines that happened in the Volga region in Kazakhstan in the 20s, and it was very easy to discredit those films based on that. You know, for instance, there's the famous girl who you always see in the pictures standing in Kharkiv with a goat behind her. And in many previous works, the goat was taken out, because people were saying, well, how can there be starvation if there's a goat in the background? So you have to be really conscious of that, not to make any kind of mistakes that could discredit the film, but also you have to be aware that this is for a general audience, so you have to make it interesting.
Did you see a lot of parallels when you were making the film about what had happened in Ukraine in the 1930s and kind of what's happening now as a result of Russia's military intervention? From
a storytelling point of view, a film about the 1930s, even though it can be interesting, people can always put it into that kind of mental box of, well, many terrible things happened in the 20th century, and yes, we're all sorry about that, but what can we do about it? What is the relevance to today? And emotionally, it doesn't really reach people necessarily. But if you relate it to what is happening to real people today, individuals, then it has an emotional impact that's much stronger, right? That's on the filmmaking level. On the level of historical parallels, well, the obvious parallel, and it's, there are sections in the film which uses archives to show that, every time Ukraine has tried to break away, whether it was 1918, whether it was 91, from, former colonial masters, there's been an armed and very violent reaction. So, many people, historians now say that the Holodomor wasn't just failed collectivization, it was punishment for, a rebellious nation, basically. That Stalin was very much aware of the fact that, Ukraine had not supported the Bolsheviks, had, tried to set up an independent state, and, it took military intervention by the Red Army to end it. So if we're talking about 1991, the obvious parallel is, once Ukraine achieves independence, once it has two revolutions that try to break free of, the Russian world, then, Russia intervenes, in the same way that, Stalin and, the Bolsheviks intervened to prevent the freedom and to prevent, the self-determination of a former colonial, entity. So I think that's like the historical parallel. But, in the film, it's not like dogmatic. It's more a personal story. So it's people who are, enmeshed in these great, movements of history. So in the 30s, you do have individuals like Rhea Clyman who took tremendous risks to show that. And today, we have the family of Serhiy Holandar, who was captured in Debaltseve, 2 days after peace was supposed to break out, and is still held as a prisoner in the so-called DNR. The story is that he's never seen his youngest daughter. She was born after he was taken prisoner. And, it's their story, really. I mean, they're telling the story of what it's like, for a family to have, to grow up without their father.
Did you come here knowing about what the events were like, and you weren't really swayed by any of the stories in the media?
In terms of my perceptions, I had been here during, the end of the Maidan period. I had been to the east in Slavyansk, where former prisoners in Generation Maidan, including people who had been kept in those, makeshift dungeons. And so I had no illusions about what had happened. And, it's more just every time you get enmeshed in another, personal, tragedy, of course, you realize the price people are paying individually, but it's not like I didn't know what was happening beforehand.
In terms of how you perceive information, just do you think that back in the 1930s, how information was perceived then and how reporters weren't actually reporting on what was happening in Ukraine, that there was the Holodomor happening, literally death by starvation, and what has changed in terms of how information was perceived then and how it's perceived now?
Right. Well, this information is one of the main themes in the film, right? And there's a lot of interesting little parallels and stories. So Rhea Clyman actually was an assistant to Walter Duranty for 9 months before she went, on the trip to Ukraine. And if you remember, Walter Duranty was a New York Times reporter who he won a Pulitzer, but very much covered up the news of the famine. And not so much out of an ideological position, but out of a realpolitik kind of position that, the Soviet Union exists and it's not going to go away and we have to deal with it. Plus the fact that, like all reporters, they had a comfortable lifestyle living in a bubble in Moscow. So they weren't about to, break out of that. But Rhea, she came as a young communist, really to the Soviet Union. But, she learned Russian, she was a freelancer, she lived in a communal apartment. So, and her boyfriend actually was arrested for currency speculation, was sent to Siberia. And that's one of the reasons she went up there, to investigate it. So she was somebody who was really a true reporter in the sense that, she reported things as she saw them. She didn't consider the ideological point of view, because clearly if she did, as a leftist, she wouldn't have written the way she did. She kind of ditched all her ideological, constraints, in the 4 years she was in the Soviet Union. A lot like George Orwell, for instance, people like that. Clearly she was not going to toe a line, and she was just going to report as she saw it. And the same afterwards, she went to Nazi Germany and pursued it in the same way after she was thrown out of the Soviet Union. Now, in terms of parallels between disinformation then, disinformation now, it's clear that it's being used, in Russia as a form of, warfare, in effect, hybrid warfare in Ukraine. But, Russia's not the only one that's doing it. We have politicians in the United States who are using it as well, and even their defenders are saying, truth, what is truth, So it's become, a worldwide phenomenon and a worldwide problem. So how do we combat that? As journalists, that's a big challenge.
I think that's a good point to leave it on. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Okay, thank you.
We were joined by Andrew Tkach. He's an award-winning filmmaker who has made a film about Rhea Clyman. It's called Hunger for Truth, the Rhea Clyman Story. You're watching UATV.